come back. Wherever you're listening from tonight, let yourself settle in fully. Let your shoulders drop an inch further into whatever is holding you up. Let your breathing slow, in through the nose, out long and easy, and let the day you've just finished get a little further away with every breath. Tonight's story is about the most ordinary object imaginable. A lumpy, dirt-covered root vegetable sitting in almost every kitchen on the planet, the kind of thing you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. And yet, this one plant helped build an empire, nearly destroyed a nation, and is now, quite seriously, one of the leading candidates to become the first crop humans ever grow on another world. None of that happened quickly, and none of it happened the way you might expect. It happened slowly, patiently, across roughly 8,000 years, carried by ordinary people making ordinary decisions about what to plant and what to eat. That's the pace we'll take tonight, too. Slow, unhurried. Let's begin the way it actually began, high above the clouds in the mountains of South America. High in the Andes, in what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, the land doesn't behave the way farmland is supposed to behave. At elevations above 12,000 feet, the air thins, the nights turn bitterly cold even when the days are warm, and the growing season is short and unforgiving. Wheat doesn't grow here. Rice doesn't grow here. Almost nothing that later became a global staple crop could survive this particular combination of altitude, cold, and thin, rocky soil. And yet, sometime around 8,000 years ago, according to genetic and archaeological evidence gathered from the region, the people living in these mountains began deliberately cultivating a small, unassuming plant that could. Andean communities managed this genuinely difficult, vertically stretched terrain through a deliberate strategy anthropologists now call verticality, a concept developed by anthropologist John Emuara, studying the region's economic organization in the mid-20th century. A single extended family or community maintained cultivation, rights spanning from high, cold potato growing zones near the frost line down through intermediate elevations suited to maize and other crops, all the way to lower valley regions offering their own distinct resources, deliberately trading and redistributing produce across this entire vertical range to guarantee reliable access to a genuinely diverse diet, regardless of what any single elevation's growing season happened to produce in any particular year. It was an entire, deliberately diversified relationship with the mountainous landscape itself. Not unlike the same careful risk-spreading instinct, these same farmers would soon apply to the potato itself. The wild ancestor of the potato was not, by any reasonable measure, an appealing food. Wild potato tubers are small, often no larger than a grape, and many varieties contain genuinely toxic levels of compounds called glycosyl alkaloids, the same general family of chemical defenses many nightshade plants use to discourage animals from eating them. Solanine and related compounds can cause nausea, cramping, and in sufficient quantity, considerably more serious harm. Early Andean farmers appear to have solved this problem through a combination of careful selective breeding, choosing and replanting tubers from whichever wild plants happened to produce lower toxin levels, and a remarkably clever piece of food processing that had nothing to do with breeding at all. That processing technique involved clay. Researchers studying the archaeological record of the region have found that early Andean communities regularly consumed a specific type of edible clay alongside their potatoes, a practice that persists in parts of the Andes even today. The clay, it turns out, binds to the toxic glycoalkaloid compounds in the digestive tract, allowing them to pass through the body harmlessly rather than being absorbed. It's a genuinely sophisticated piece of practical chemistry, arrived at entirely through patient trial and observation, long before anyone had any theoretical understanding of what a glycoalkaloid actually was. Eat the mildly toxic potato. Eat a bit of the right clay alongside it, and the toxin never gets the chance to do its damage. Generations of careful selective breeding for naturally lower toxin varieties eventually made this workaround less necessary, but the clay-eating tradition itself outlasted the need for it by thousands of years. A solved problem solution, quietly persisting long after most people had forgotten exactly why it started. Once domestication took hold, Andean farmers did something with the potato that still genuinely astonishes researchers studying agricultural biodiversity today. Rather than narrowing the plant down toward one or two efficient, high-yield varieties, the way many later agricultural traditions eventually would, Andean communities instead cultivated an almost unimaginable range of distinct potato varieties, adapted to every conceivable combination of altitude, soil, and microclimate their mountainous terrain offered. the International Potato Center, headquartered in Lima, Peru, and dedicated specifically to studying and preserving potato genetic diversity, maintains a living collection today of more than 4,000 distinct traditional potato varieties gathered from across the Andes, ranging in color from pale cream to deep purple, in shape from smooth ovals to knuckled, almost fist-like tubers, each one carrying its own specific combination of traits suited to one particular corner of this genuinely difficult landscape. This diversity wasn't decorative. It was insurance. A single Andean farming family might plant a dozen or more distinct potato varieties across their scattered plots, each one occupying a slightly different elevation and facing a slightly different set of risks, so that a frost, a blight, or a poor season that devastated one variety would very likely leave several others largely untouched. It's worth sitting with how thoroughly this differs from the kind of agriculture that would eventually spread across most of the rest of the world, concentrated on a small handful of highly productive, genetically similar varieties. That difference, as we'll see much later tonight, would eventually matter more than almost anyone in Europe ever properly understood. The civilization that would eventually raise this humble root, vegetable, to genuinely imperial importance was the Inca, whose empire, at its height in the early 1500, stretched along the Andes for roughly 2,500 miles, from modern Colombia down through Chile, encompassing an extraordinary range of elevation and climate. Feeding an empire this vast, spread across terrain this difficult, required real logistical genius, and the potato sat close to the center of how the Inca actually managed it. Inca farmers developed a preservation technique called chunayo, and it deserves a slow, careful description, since it represents one of the more genuinely ingenious pieces of ancient food technology anywhere in the world. High-altitude Andean nights regularly drop well below freezing, even when daytime temperatures remain comfortably mild. Inca farmers took advantage of this dramatic daily temperature swing by spreading harvested potatoes out across the ground overnight, allowing them to freeze solid in the cold mountain air. The following day, as temperatures rose, workers, often entire communities working together, would walk across the thawing potatoes barefoot, pressing out the moisture that the freezing process had already begun separating from the starch within each tuber. This freeze-thaw-press cycle was repeated across several days, gradually drawing out nearly all the water content until what remained was a hard, lightweight, almost stone-like dried potato that could be stored for years without spoiling. Chunyo solved a problem that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with survival at scale. A fresh potato, like most fresh produce, spoils within weeks or months. Chunyo, properly prepared and stored, could last for a decade or longer, providing the Inca state with a genuine strategic food reserve, distributed through an extensive network of state storehouses called KOLCA, positioned along the empire's road system, ready to feed soldiers during military campaigns, workers during large state construction projects, or entire regions during a poor harvest year elsewhere in the empire. Some researchers studying Inca administrative records, kept not in writing, but in an elaborate system of knotted cords called keiipu, have found evidence suggesting stored chunayo and other preserved foods played a genuinely central role in how the Inca state financed its own considerable ambitions, feeding the very labor that built its roads, its terraces, and its monumental architecture. The Inca keiipu, that elaborate system of knotted and colored cords, used to record information across the empire without any written alphabet at all, has only in recent decades begun yielding up its genuine secrets to researchers studying it seriously. For a long time, scholars assumed keiipu could only record numerical information, tallies, and quantities, since the knots themselves clearly encoded a base 10 counting system Spanish colonial administrators recognized and documented at the time. More recent research, including detailed work by anthropologist Sabin H. Wyland, studying surviving keiipu from village archives in Peru, has suggested that at least some keiipu likely encoded considerably richer information than simple numbers, potentially including narrative or administrative detail, whose full decoding remains, honestly, still incomplete today. Whatever specific information a given keiipu recorded, we know with real confidence that Inca administrators used this same knotted cord system extensively to track stored chunayo across the empire's vast network of KOLCA storehouses, meaning the potato's own careful management sat close to the center of one of history's more genuinely unusual record-keeping systems. An entire empire's logistics quite literally tied together in knots. It's worth pausing to really imagine the scene Chunayo making would have actually produced, since it's a genuinely striking, almost dance-like piece of communal labor. Entire hillsides covered in a thin layer of potatoes, pale under frost in the first gray light of morning. Families and neighbors gathering as the sun climbed, stepping barefoot across the half-frozen, half-thawed tubers in slow, deliberate rhythm, squeezing water out with each patient footstep, the cold biting at bare feet, even as the sun began warming the surrounding air. It would have been repeated, this same scene, across countless Andean communities, for countless generations, an entire empire's food security resting, quite literally, on the accumulated pressure of many thousands of bare feet. The potato's importance to Andean life extended well beyond pure survival calculus into genuine cultural and spiritual significance. Archaeologists have recovered potato-shaped ceramic vessels from pre-Inca burial sites, and some researchers studying Andean cosmology have proposed that potato harvests were closely tied to religious ceremony and seasonal ritual, the plant's own underground growth cycle, invisible until harvest, carrying symbolic weight connected to fertility, the earth, and renewal. Whether or not every specific ritual interpretation holds up to careful scholarly scrutiny, the sheer volume of potato-related imagery and ceremony documented across Andean archaeology confirms this was never simply a practical food crop to the people who first domesticated it. It was something closer to a foundation, in both the literal agricultural sense and a considerably deeper cultural one. For roughly 8,000 years, this entire remarkable story, the domestication, the clay-eating detoxification technique, the thousands of distinct varieties, Chunayo, and the empire it helped feed, remained almost completely unknown to the rest of the world. Europe had no idea the potato existed. Asia had no idea. Africa had no idea. An entire sophisticated agricultural tradition, sufficient to help sustain one of history's largest pre-industrial empires, had developed in complete isolation, high in one particular stretch of mountains, simply because no one outside the Americas had any reason yet to know it was there. That isolation ended abruptly and violently in the 1530, when Spanish conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes, beginning a military campaign that would, within a few short years, bring down the Inca Empire entirely. The conquest itself is its own vast difficult history, well beyond what tonight's story can properly hold. What matters for our particular thread is simpler, and in its own way, considerably more mundane. Spanish colonizers, moving through conquered Inca territory, began encountering this strange, lumpy root vegetable that local populations depended on so completely, and eventually, curious or simply hungry, began trying it themselves. One of the earliest surviving written European descriptions of the potato comes from Pedro Cieza de Leown, a Spanish chronicler traveling through the Andes in the 1540, who described local farmers cultivating a small, round root, similar to a truffle, that formed the basis of the region's daily diet. Cieza de Leown's account, eventually published in 1553 as part of his broader chronicle of Peru, represents one of the first attempts by any European to describe this genuinely unfamiliar plant in writing. Reaching for the closest comparison, his own culinary vocabulary actually offered him. A truffle was, at least, a reasonable starting point, an unglamorous, earth-covered thing dug up from underground, though the comparison would end up creating almost as much confusion as it resolved. The potato's actual journey to Europe remains somewhat unclear in its precise details, since no single dramatic account survives describing exactly when the first tubers crossed the Atlantic. Most historians place the earliest transport sometime in the 1560 or 1570, likely carried aboard Spanish ships returning from South America, initially valued more as a curious botanical specimen than as any kind of significant food source. Records from Spanish hospitals in Seville, dating to the 1570, document potatoes being purchased and served to patients, suggesting the plant had, by this point, at least found a foothold in institutional kitchens, even if it remained a genuine rarity anywhere else. The earliest surviving European illustration of the potato appears somewhat later in John Gerard's Herbal, an influential English botanical text first published in 1597, which included a careful woodcut illustration alongside a written description identifying the plant, with considerable confusion, as a Virginia potato, mistakenly suggesting an origin in North America rather than the actual Andean homeland thousands of miles further south. Gerard himself claimed to have grown the plant successfully in his own London garden, and his book's illustration, however geographically confused its accompanying text turned out to be, represents one of the very first attempts anywhere in Europe to document the plant's actual physical appearance in careful, deliberate botanical detail, complete with its distinctive star-shaped flowers and irregular, knobbed tubers rendered in careful woodcut line work for readers who had, in the vast majority of cases, never encountered anything remotely like it before. A considerable amount of early European confusion about the potato traces back to a simple, understandable naming mix-up. Europeans had already encountered a different, unrelated crop from the Americas, the sweet potato, called batata in the language of the Taino people of the Caribbean, and had already begun cultivating it in parts of Spain and Portugal by the time the actual potato, a genuinely different plant from an entirely different botanical family, arrived from the Andes. Because the two plants shared a similar underground growth habit and arrived from the same broad New World, European naming conventions collapsed the distinction between them almost immediately. The English word potato itself descends directly from batata, a name that, strictly speaking, was never really the Andean plant's own name at all, but its unrelated Caribbean cousins, borrowed and reassigned through simple, unexamined convenience. This same naming confusion reflected a deeper, more consequential problem. Since 16th century European botanists, working from an inherited classical framework for organizing the natural world, weren't entirely sure what to make of the potato at all. It clearly belonged, structurally, to the same nightshade family as deadly nightshade itself, a genuinely poisonous plant, well known and rightly feared throughout Europe for centuries. Swiss botanist K. A. Espar Bohn, cataloging plants in the early 1600, formally classified the potato within this same nightshade family, a scientifically accurate classification that would nonetheless go on to seriously damage the potato's reputation for the next 2 centuries, as we'll see shortly. Being correctly identified as a close relative of a genuinely deadly plant, it turns out, is not always the fastest route to becoming anyone's dinner. The potato spent its first several decades in Europe largely as a curiosity, grown in botanical gardens and the estates of wealthy collectors more interested in unusual New World specimens than in any practical culinary application. Its flowers, delicate and star-shaped, occasionally caught the attention of aristocratic gardeners, entirely apart from the edible tubers growing unnoticed beneath the soil. It's a genuinely strange thought to sit with tonight, that a plant now feeding a meaningful share of the entire human species once spent generations being appreciated primarily for its flowers by people who had little idea or little interest in discovering what was quietly forming underground the whole time. It's worth pausing here at the edge of the potato's actual European story to notice something about the shape of what we've covered so far tonight. 8,000 years of Andean cultivation, an empire's careful logistics, thousands of distinct varieties, an entire preservation technology built from bare feet and mountain frost, all of it compressed from a European vantage point into a single unglamorous route that arrived quietly on a cargo ship, misnamed, mistrusted, and initially valued mostly for its flowers. The real story hadn't even properly begun yet. It was about to get considerably more difficult and considerably more consequential than anyone unloading those first crates in Seville could possibly have imagined. It's worth taking a moment to place the potato's transatlantic journey within its proper, much larger context, since it was never an isolated event. Historian A. Alfred Crosby, writing in the 1970s, coined the term Columbian exchange to describe the vast, largely unplanned transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people that followed Columbus's voyages, reshaping agriculture and diet on every inhabited continent within just a few generations. Tomatoes, maize, cacao, and tobacco flowed outward from the Americas toward Europe, Africa, and Asia, while wheat, horses, cattle, and, devastatingly, a range of old world diseases flowed the opposite direction into the Americas, with consequences for indigenous populations that were catastrophic, almost beyond calculation. The potato was simply one thread within this much larger, genuinely world-altering exchange, though it would eventually prove to be one of the exchange's most consequential single threads, for reasons that had everything to do with basic, practical nutrition. Here's why the potato mattered so much, stated plainly, since the underlying reason is worth understanding clearly before we watch Europe spend nearly 2 centuries failing to appreciate it. Calorie for calorie, and acre for acre, few staple crops available anywhere in early modern Europe could match what a potato field could actually produce. A given plot of land planted with potatoes could reliably generate roughly 2 to 4 times the caloric yield of the same plot planted with wheat, largely because potatoes convert sunlight and soil nutrients into dense, starchy, edible tubers with genuinely remarkable efficiency. And because a potato crop matures in a shorter growing season than most cereal grains, allowing farmers in some climates to fit in an additional harvest within a single year. The potato also carries a meaningfully more complete basic nutritional profile than cereal grains alone, including a genuinely useful quantity of vitamin C, a nutrient European sailors on long ocean voyages were, during this same general period, dying from the lack of entirely, well before anyone had properly identified scurvy's actual cause. None of this practical advantage mattered in the slightest to a continent that had already decided, based on genuinely reasonable seeming evidence at the time, that the potato was something to be feared rather than farmed. It looked wrong to European eyes, its edible portion buried invisibly underground rather than growing openly toward the sun, the way properly respectable crops were expected to. It belonged, correctly, to the same botanical family as a plant that could kill you, and unlike wheat, rice, or barley, it appeared nowhere in Scripture, a genuinely significant point of suspicion in an era when a food's absence from the Bible could be treated, by at least some skeptical clergy, as meaningful evidence against it. We'll spend the next stretch of tonight's journey watching Europe slowly, reluctantly, and sometimes through outright deception, come around to a crop that had already been quietly, reliably feeding an entire mountain empire for thousands of years before a single European ever tasted it. It's a genuinely strange kind of delay to sit with, that so much genuine hardship in the centuries that followed might have been at least partly softened, had suspicion given way to acceptance just a little sooner than it eventually, grudgingly, did. France offers one of the more vivid examples of just how seriously this suspicion actually ran. French physicians and clergy throughout the 1600 and well into the 1700 repeatedly linked potato consumption to leprosy, an association with no genuine medical basis whatsoever, but one that proved remarkably persistent once established. The French Parliament of Besançon went so far as to formally ban potato cultivation in 1748, explicitly citing the belief that eating potatoes caused leprosy, a prohibition that remained in effect for decades in some regions even as neighboring territories quietly, gradually began growing them without any comparable outbreak of the disease their neighbors so confidently predicted. Russia developed its own distinct strain of potato suspicion, rooted less in specific disease fears and more in a broader religious unease about a crop that had arrived from an unfamiliar continent with no scriptural precedent at all. Russian peasants in some regions referred to the potato as the devil's apple, and rumors circulated that consuming it endangered a person's very soul. This suspicion proved durable enough that when Tsarist authorities eventually attempted to encourage potato cultivation as a hedge against periodic famine, the effort sparked genuine, organized resistance in several regions. The unrest, beginning in 1834 and recurring with particular intensity during the 1840, is sometimes called the potato riots, and it deserves a slightly fuller account, since it reveals just how seriously and how violently agricultural policy resistance could occasionally turn. State-owned peasants across several Russian provinces rose up against government mandates requiring them to plant potatoes on communal land, in some cases attacking local officials sent to enforce the policy, and destroying the very potato plots authorities had ordered planted. Historians studying the unrest generally attribute it to a genuine tangle of causes beyond simple superstition alone, including deep-seated peasant distrust of any state-imposed agricultural mandate, confusion and resentment over exactly whose land the new potato plots were actually meant to occupy, and lingering religious unease about a crop still popularly associated, in at least some communities, with spiritual danger. Russian authorities eventually suppressed the unrest through a combination of military force and gradually adjusted policy, and potato cultivation did eventually spread successfully across Russia in the following decades regardless, becoming, within another generation or two, every bit as central to Russian daily diet as it had already become across much of the rest of Europe. The earlier violent resistance fading into a historical footnote, most ordinary Russian potato farmers, only a few decades later, likely never gave any serious thought to at all. Scotland's particular objection carried its own distinct religious flavor. Some Presbyterian clergy in the 1700 reportedly refused to eat potatoes specifically because the plant went entirely unmentioned in the Bible, reasoning that any food this significant would surely have warranted scriptural acknowledgement had it genuinely been intended for human consumption. It's a genuinely striking thing to sit with, that an argument from scriptural silence applied to a plant whose actual history stretched back 8,000 years on a continent the Bible's authors had no way of knowing existed, managed to delay potato adoption among at least some communities for a meaningful stretch of additional time, turning this widespread suspicion around required more than simple patient persuasion. And one of history's more genuinely entertaining examples of successful agricultural marketing comes from France, where a military pharmacist named Antoine Augustin Parmentier became personally, almost obsessively, convinced of the potato's genuine value after an unlikely wartime introduction to it, captured by Prussian forces during the 7 Years' War in the 1760 and held as a prisoner. Parmentier was fed potatoes repeatedly during his captivity, since Prussia, unlike France, had already begun relying on the crop as reliable prisoner and army rations. Rather than resenting the experience, Parmentier emerged from captivity genuinely convinced the potato could help solve France's persistent, recurring problem with grain shortages and famine. Parmentier's campaign to convince skeptical French society to actually eat what he'd become convinced of required real creativity, since simply publishing pamphlets extolling the potato's nutritional virtues, which he also did, wasn't proving nearly persuasive enough on its own. In one particularly well-documented episode, Parmentier secured royal permission to plant a substantial potato field on genuinely unpromising land outside Paris, then arranged for the field to be conspicuously guarded by armed soldiers during the day, a display calculated to suggest the crop growing there must be valuable enough to warrant serious protection. At night, Parmentier deliberately withdrew the guards, allowing local farmers to sneak in and steal the supposedly precious tubers for their own use, exactly as he had hoped and intended they would. It's a wonderfully human piece of reverse psychology, using the theater of scarcity to manufacture genuine desire for a plant French farmers had spent generations actively avoiding. Parmentier also cultivated genuine royal enthusiasm for the cause, reportedly presenting potato flowers to King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, who wore the small purple blossoms in her own hair at court on at least one occasion, lending the humble tuber an entirely unexpected touch of aristocratic fashion. Parmentier hosted dinners for prominent guests, including Benjamin Franklin, at which every single course, remarkably, was prepared using potatoes, a genuinely committed piece of culinary advocacy designed to demonstrate the plant's actual versatility rather than simply asserting it. His efforts, combined with genuine, recurring grain shortages that made an alternative staple crop increasingly attractive on purely practical grounds, gradually shifted French attitudes across the final decades of the 1700, and the potato dish known as Hatchai's Parmentier still carries his name in French kitchens today, a lasting culinary monument to one pharmacist's genuinely persistent advocacy. Antoine Parmentier's own career, worth spending a little more time with, extended considerably beyond his famous potato advocacy alone. Trained originally as a military pharmacist, Parmentier went on to make genuine, lasting contributions to French public health and nutrition science more broadly, including influential work on flour milling, bread quality, and vaccination promotion during a later smallpox outbreak. His potato advocacy, while certainly the achievement history has chosen to remember him for most vividly, reflected a broader, genuinely consistent lifelong pattern. A trained scientist, repeatedly, patiently working to translate careful research into practical improvements for ordinary people's daily nutrition and health, regardless of how much skepticism or outright resistance he happened to encounter along the way. Parmentier died in 1813, and his name remains attached today not only to potato dishes across French cuisine, but to a Paris metro station and a boulevard, a lasting civic honor for a man whose most famous single achievement began with a captured soldier being fed a food his own country would spend decades still refusing to eat. Prussia's own path toward potato adoption, the very path that had fed Parmentier during his captivity years earlier, followed a considerably more forceful route than France's eventual gradual persuasion. King Frederick II, generally remembered as Frederick the Great, issued a series of formal decrees beginning in 1756, sometimes called potato ukases, ordering Prussian farmers to plant the crop as a hedge against the recurring famines that had repeatedly devastated the kingdom's population. When initial compliance proved disappointingly weak, Frederick's government reportedly threatened genuinely serious punishment for continued refusal, though modern historians studying the surviving documentary record note the harshest specific punishments described may reflect later exaggeration and popular legend more than confirmed consistently enforced royal policy. What does appear well documented is that Frederick, much like Parmentier, would independently attempt in France a few years later, also employed a version of the same reverse psychology scarcity trick, ordering royal potato fields planted and then conspicuously guarded, specifically to convince skeptical peasants the crop must be valuable enough to steal. Whether Frederick's version of the story directly inspired Parmentier's later French effort, or whether both men simply arrived independently at the same basic, remarkably effective insight about human psychology and forbidden fruit, remains genuinely unclear from the historical record, and it's worth holding that uncertainty honestly rather than confidently crediting either man as history's sole originator of the trick. Frederick's more forceful approach, whatever its exact methods, proved genuinely decisive for Prussia's own agricultural resilience. By the time a severe, widespread famine struck much of Europe in 1770 and 1771, driven by catastrophic grain harvest failures across the continent, Prussian regions that had complied with the earlier potato decrees weathered the crisis considerably better than neighboring territories that had continued resisting the crop. A genuinely stark, practical demonstration that proved more persuasive to many remaining skeptics than any amount of prior royal decree or pharmacist's dinner party ever had managed to be on its own. Frederick the Great is buried today at Sanssouci, his palace outside Potsdam, and visitors still leave potatoes at his grave, a genuinely fitting, if unofficial, modern tribute to a policy that likely saved a meaningful number of his own subjects' lives. Ireland's own introduction to the potato followed a quieter, less dramatically documented path than France or Prussia's, but it would eventually prove the single most consequential adoption story in the plant's entire European history, for reasons we'll spend considerable time with shortly. The potato likely arrived in Ireland sometime in the late 1500, possibly through Spanish trade contact, or, according to some accounts, salvaged from Spanish Armada shipwrecks along the Irish coast in 1588, though the precise route remains genuinely uncertain. What is clear is that Ireland's cool, damp climate and generally poor soil quality, land considered marginal or entirely unsuitable for most European cereal crops, turned out to be remarkably well suited to potato cultivation. And Irish tenant farmers, working small plots under a genuinely difficult land tenure system, controlled largely by absentee English landlords, adopted the crop with a speed and thoroughness unmatched almost anywhere else in Europe. By the early 1800, a substantial share of Ireland's rural population had come to depend on the potato as their overwhelmingly primary food source. In some documented cases, eating little else across an entire year beyond potatoes and buttermilk. Historians studying the period generally attribute this deep dependence to a specific, difficult combination of factors: an oppressive land system that left most Irish tenant farmers with only small plots on which to grow enough food to survive, and the simple, undeniable fact that potatoes could produce more usable calories on a small plot of genuinely poor land than any realistic alternative crop available to them. This same population had also grown considerably. Historians estimate roughly doubling across the preceding half-century, a growth many researchers directly attribute to the potato's own remarkable nutritional efficiency, finally allowing more children to survive to adulthood than the land could previously have supported through cereal farming alone. Irish tenant farming in this period operated under a system called Conacre, in which extremely small plots of land, sometimes barely an acre or two, were rented out at high cost by landlords, many of them absentee, living in England, and taking little direct interest in the specific conditions their tenants actually faced. A farming family working a plot this small had genuinely limited room to diversify what they grew, and the potatoes' remarkable caloric yield per acre made it, in practical terms, nearly the only crop capable of producing enough food to sustain a family on land this constrained. Economic historians studying the period note that this same land system had developed over the preceding century, specifically because it allowed landlords to extract maximum rental income from their holdings, while subdividing land into ever smaller plots as Ireland's rural population continued growing. A structural arrangement that left an enormous share of the population with essentially no meaningful buffer once their single dominant crop failed. It's worth sitting gently with the shape of what we've traced across this first long stretch of tonight's journey. A plant domesticated over 8,000 patient years in the Andes, carried across an ocean, initially fetishized for its flowers and feared for its family tree, eventually forced, coaxed, and reasoned into wider European acceptance through royal decree, wartime captivity, and one pharmacist's genuinely inspired theater of manufactured scarcity. And now, in Ireland specifically, that same plant had become something considerably more precarious than any of its earlier champions had likely intended. An entire nation's survival narrowing down toward dependence on one single crop, grown in a detail that will matter enormously very soon, from a genuinely limited pool of just a few imported varieties in a country half a world away from the thousands of distinct varieties that had once made the potato's Andean homeland so resilient against exactly this kind of risk. Let's slow down considerably for this next part of tonight's story, since it deserves real care rather than any rush toward its difficult conclusion. In September of 1845, Irish farmers began noticing something wrong with their potato plants. Leaves that should have been healthy and green were instead turning black and curling at the edges. And when farmers dug up the tubers themselves, expecting the usual firm, pale flesh, they found many of them already rotting, soft and discolored, giving off a smell of decay that would, within just a few short years, hang over entire counties. The cause, though nobody in Ireland could have identified it with any certainty at the time, was a water mold called Phytophthora ineffiestans, an organism that spreads through airborne spores, capable of traveling considerable distances on damp wind, infecting healthy potato plants within days under the right cool, moist conditions. Exactly the conditions Ireland's climate reliably provided. The blight likely arrived in Europe from the Americas, probably central Mexico, carried inadvertently aboard ships involved in the era's expanding transatlantic trade, and it struck potato crops across a considerable stretch of Europe that same year, not Ireland alone. What made Ireland's experience so uniquely catastrophic wasn't the blight's mere presence, since France, Belgium, and other regions suffered genuine crop losses too. It was the specific, narrow combination of circumstances Ireland alone had assembled across the preceding decades. It's worth understanding a little more of the actual biology behind phytophthora ineffestans, since the mechanism itself helps explain exactly why the blight spread with such devastating, almost unstoppable speed once conditions turned favorable for it. The organism reproduces through microscopic spores that form on the underside of infected leaves, released in enormous numbers during cool, damp weather, and carried outward on wind and rain to neighboring plants, sometimes traveling considerable distances before finding a new potato leaf to infect. Once established on a new plant, the pathogen can complete an entire reproductive cycle, infection to new spore production, in as little as 5 days under ideal cool, humid conditions, meaning a single infected field could seed catastrophic infection across an entire surrounding region within just a few short weeks. Ireland's own characteristically cool, damp, and cloudy climate, ordinarily so well suited to potato cultivation in the first place, turned out to be almost perfectly suited to the blight's own reproductive cycle as well, a cruel coincidence of exactly the same weather conditions that had made the crop so reliable in Ireland for the previous 2 centuries, suddenly working just as efficiently in the blight's favor. Instead, remember the genetic diversity that had once protected Andean farmers from exactly this kind of catastrophic single-point failure. The dozens of distinct varieties any one family might plant across scattered plots at different elevations. Ireland's potato crop carried almost none of that same built-in protection. The vast majority of Irish potato farmland had been planted with a single variety, commonly called the Emperor, prized specifically for its high yield on genuinely poor soil, but carrying, as an unfortunate and entirely unknown consequence of that same narrow genetic uniformity, almost no natural resistance to phytophthora ineffestans whatsoever. When the blight found one Emperor plant vulnerable, it had, in practical terms, found every Emperor plant vulnerable, an entire nation's dominant food source, sharing a single genetic weakness with a thoroughness the diverse, deliberately varied fields of the Andes had specifically evolved over thousands of years to prevent. The blight returned in 1846, considerably more severe than the previous year's outbreak, destroying an estimated 3/4 of that year's entire potato harvest across Ireland. It would return again in subsequent years throughout the remainder of the decade, with varying but consistently serious severity, transforming what had initially seemed like a single difficult season into a sustained, multi-year catastrophe that Irish agriculture and the Irish population dependent on it simply had no adequate way to absorb. The human consequences unfolded with a scale that historians still find genuinely difficult to fully convey. Best current estimates suggest roughly 1 million people died in Ireland between 1845 and 1852 from starvation itself and from the diseases typhus, dysentery, and cholera among them that spread with devastating speed through populations already weakened by sustained hunger. A further estimated 1 to 2 million people emigrated during this same period, many aboard overcrowded, poorly provisioned vessels that came to be known, grimly and accurately, as coffin ships, since a meaningful share of passengers died during the crossing itself, never reaching the new lives in North America, Britain, or Australia they had desperately set out toward. It's worth spending a little more careful time with the famine's own human texture, since the driest historical summary can sometimes obscure just how genuinely difficult daily survival actually became for ordinary families living through it. Workhouses, institutions established under Ireland's poor law system to provide minimal relief in exchange for labor, became severely overcrowded within the famine's first years, with conditions inside deteriorating so badly that disease often spread more readily within their crowded walls than it might have among the general starving population outside them. Soup kitchens, established through a mix of government and private charitable effort, provided some genuine relief during 1847 specifically, a year sometimes remembered somewhat differently from the famine's other years, precisely because this particular relief effort, however imperfect, reached a genuinely meaningful number of people before being controversially wound down later that same year due to cost concerns among the officials administering it. Families frequently faced impossible choices between staying together and risking collective starvation, or splitting apart, with some members remaining and others attempting the difficult, uncertain journey toward emigration. never knowing with any certainty whether they would ever see each other again. Ship manifests and surviving personal letters from the period, studied carefully by historians since, document journeys across the Atlantic lasting anywhere from 5 to 12 weeks in conditions of severe overcrowding, inadequate food and water, and rampant disease, conditions serious enough that mortality rates aboard some of the worst documented coffin ships reached as high as 30% of all passengers before the ship ever reached its destination port. Ireland's total population, which had stood at roughly 8 million before the famine began, is estimated to have fallen by 20 to 25% within just a few years. Through the combined toll of death and departure, a demographic wound the country would not fully recover from for well over a century afterward. It would be a genuine disservice to this history to describe it purely as a natural disaster, a blight arriving and a population simply tragically starving as a result, since the human decisions surrounding the crisis mattered enormously to how severe its consequences actually became. Ireland, throughout the famine years, continued exporting substantial quantities of other foodstuffs, including grain, livestock, and dairy products, to England and elsewhere, even as its own population starved. Since these exports were produced primarily on larger commercial farms controlled by landlords with little direct stake in the survival of the tenant farmers suffering the blight's worst effects. The British government's official response, shaped significantly by the prevailing economic ideology of the period, and administered largely through Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant most directly responsible for relief policy, proved persistently, and by the assessment of most historians studying the period, inadequately slow and insufficient relative to the genuine scale of suffering actually unfolding. Trevelyan himself is recorded as expressing the view that the famine represented, in some providential sense, a natural corrective to what he considered Ireland's excessive population, a genuinely chilling piece of historical record that historians, including S.C. Cecil Woodham Smith, whose 1962 book, The Great Hunger, remains one of the most influential accounts of the period, have identified as reflecting real, documented indifference at the highest levels of the government, actually responsible for organizing relief. It's worth being careful and precise here, in a way that honors the genuine complexity historians continue actively debating, rather than flattening a difficult history into a simpler story than the evidence actually supports. The blight itself was a genuine natural phenomenon, not a deliberate human weapon. But the famine's true scale, the specific, catastrophic gap between a serious agricultural crisis and one of the deadliest famines in modern European history, reflected a compounding set of human decisions and existing structural inequalities, a land system that had left Irish tenant farmers dependent on a single crop in the first place, and a government response that many historians continue to describe with real and considered evidence behind the judgment as inadequate, and in Trevi Ilyan's own recorded case, disturbingly indifferent to the specific suffering it was meant to address. It's worth acknowledging honestly that even the famine's own name carries genuine, ongoing debate. Irish speakers have long used the phrase an Giúrta mór, meaning the Great Hunger, a naming choice some historians and commentators prefer precisely because it centers the specific human experience of hunger and suffering rather than the more neutral English word famine, which some argue can obscure the extent to which human policy decisions rather than simple agricultural failure alone shaped the crisis's true catastrophic scale. A smaller number of historians and commentators have gone further still, arguing the British government's response met a reasonable modern definition of genocide, given the continued food exports and documented official indifference we discussed earlier, while the considerably more widely held mainstream historical position holds that the famine, while reflecting genuine, serious governmental failure and neglect, does not meet the specific legal and historical criteria most scholars apply to that particular term. This remains a genuinely live, actively debated question among historians studying the period, and it's worth knowing that debate exists honestly, rather than presenting any single settled verdict as though the matter were fully closed. The famine's economic aftershocks extended well beyond the immediate crisis years, reshaping Irish land ownership patterns for generations afterward. The Encumbered Estates Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1849, allowed heavily indebted landlord estates, many pushed toward bankruptcy by the famine's own economic disruption, to be sold off, often to new owners with even less personal connection to the tenant farmers actually working the land than the original landlords had maintained. Evictions increased substantially during and after the famine years, as struggling landlords and new estate purchasers alike sought to consolidate smaller tenant plots into larger, more commercially efficient farms, displacing families who had already lost so much to starvation and disease, with the additional loss of whatever land tenure they had still managed to retain. It's a difficult, compounding history, worth acknowledging honestly, that recovery from the famine itself was, for many Irish families, immediately followed by an entirely separate wave of displacement, layered directly on top of a catastrophe. Most of them were still actively grieving the famine's demographic and cultural consequences, extended for generations well beyond the crisis years themselves. Irish emigration, already substantial during the famine period, continued at elevated levels for decades afterward, fundamentally reshaping Irish communities, not just at home, but across the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia, where millions of people today can trace their own ancestry directly back to families who left Ireland during or shortly after this same catastrophic decade. The Irish language, already under pressure before the famine, suffered further significant decline in the crisis's aftermath, as some of the regions hit hardest by starvation and emigration had also been among the country's strongest remaining Irish-speaking communities. Agricultural scientists studying the famine in the considerably longer retrospect available today have identified its underlying lesson as one of the clearest, most consequential case studies in the entire history of agriculture. A lesson about the genuine, sometimes catastrophic risk hiding inside genetic uniformity. Modern plant breeders and agricultural policymakers still reference the Irish potato famine directly when discussing the dangers of monoculture farming. The practice of relying heavily on a single crop variety across a large agricultural area, precisely because a population this genetically uniform offers a single, unified point of failure that a genuinely diverse population of crop varieties, the very kind Andean farmers had cultivated for 8,000 years, specifically to avoid this exact risk, simply does not share. It's a difficult, sobering irony worth sitting with quietly for a moment, that the very diversity which had once made the potato so remarkably resilient in its original Andean homeland had been almost entirely stripped away by the time the crop reached the one country that would come to depend on it most completely and most catastrophically. It's worth knowing, too, that Phytophthora ineffiestans itself never actually went away. Late blight remains, to this day, one of the most economically damaging plant diseases affecting agriculture anywhere in the world, causing an estimated several $billion in crop losses and control costs globally every single year. A genuinely persistent adversary that modern farmers, equipped with fungicides, resistant varieties, and considerably more sophisticated agricultural science than anyone in 1840s Ireland ever had access to, still have to actively manage rather than simply defeat outright. Newer, more aggressive strains of the pathogen continue periodically emerging and spreading, requiring constant, ongoing vigilance from plant scientists and farmers alike. Researchers, including Ernan Berbier and colleagues, publishing genetic analysis in 2013, successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material from century-and-a-half-old preserved blight samples held in herbarium collections dating to the famine years themselves, confirming the specific pathogen strain responsible for the 1840s catastrophe, sometimes called the Herb 1 strain, and tracing its likely origins back toward the Americas with considerably more genetic precision than historians had previously been able to establish through documentary evidence alone. The famine's specific catastrophic scale is very unlikely to repeat itself in quite the same way, thanks to the genetic diversity, scientific monitoring, and simple lack of single crop dependence most modern agricultural systems now maintain. But the blight itself, the same organism responsible for so much of tonight's most difficult chapter, is still out there tonight, in fields somewhere on nearly every continent, doing precisely what it has always patiently done, waiting for exactly the right damp, cool conditions to quietly begin spreading again. The Irish famine itself has continued receiving genuine, formal acknowledgement in the considerably longer years since it ended, a recognition that arrived, in some respects, remarkably late. In 1997, on the famine's 150th anniversary, British Prime Minister Tony Blair issued a formal statement acknowledging the British government's own historical failures in its response to the crisis, stating plainly that those who governed in London at the time had failed their people through a rigid adherence to a free market economic ideology that had allowed a genuine natural disaster to become a considerably deeper human catastrophe. Ireland's own National Famine Memorial, a striking bronze sculpture depicting a ghostly, skeletal ship crewed by starving figures, stands today at Risk, at the base of the Mountain Crow Piateric in County Mayo, a considered permanent piece of public memory, honoring the estimated 1 million people who died, and the millions more who were forced to leave everything they knew behind them. It's a fitting kind of acknowledgement for tonight's story to include a reminder that even history's quieter, more agricultural catastrophes deserve the same considered memory and honest reckoning we might more readily extend to war or conquest. One further piece of preservation work deserves inclusion here. Beginning in 1935, Ireland's Folklore Commission organized a systematic effort to collect oral histories and traditional knowledge from Irish communities nationwide, and a specific, dedicated questionnaire distributed in 1945 on the famine's own centenary asked ordinary people across the country to record whatever memories, family stories, and local knowledge about the Great Famine still survived within their own communities, nearly a full century after the crisis itself. The resulting collection, held today at University College Dublin, preserved thousands of pages of first-hand and second-hand testimony, local famine-era place names, songs, and family memories that would very likely have been lost entirely within another generation or two, as the last people with any direct family connection to the famine years themselves gradually passed away. It stands as its own quiet, deliberate act of exactly the same kind of preservation instinct we've returned to so many times across tonight's journey, recognizing that a story this significant, whether encoded in a potato's own genetic diversity or in an elderly farmer's carefully remembered family account, deserves real, deliberate effort to make sure it actually survives long enough to be told again. Let's move gently forward now, out of the famine's genuine darkness and into the considerably longer, quieter story of exactly how the potato went on to become one of the most widely grown food crops on the entire planet, a global staple eaten in some form on every inhabited continent. That global spread was already well underway, even as Ireland suffered its own catastrophic experience with the crop, since by the mid-1800s the potato had already established itself as a genuine dietary staple across large stretches of continental Europe, from Germany and Poland through much of Eastern Europe and Russia, regions whose own relationship with the crop, while occasionally difficult in its earlier decades, had generally avoided Ireland's specific, catastrophic combination of single variety dependence and structural land inequality. The potato's arrival in North America followed its own distinct path, carried initially by European colonists and later reinforced by the substantial wave of Irish immigration that followed the famine years directly. American potato cultivation gradually concentrated in specific regions, offering particularly favorable growing conditions, cool nights, warm days, and well-drained volcanic soil, proving especially productive, with the Snake River Valley of Idaho eventually emerging as the country's single most significant potato-growing region by the early 20th century. Idaho's now famous association with the crop developed gradually rather than through any single dramatic moment. But by the 1930, deliberate state marketing efforts had begun actively promoting Idaho potatoes as a distinct, premium regional product, an early and genuinely successful example of agricultural branding that would eventually make Idaho potato a recognized phrase largely synonymous with quality across the entire American market. Idaho's own, now famous potato branding deserves a slightly closer look, since it developed through a genuinely deliberate, sustained marketing effort, rather than simply emerging naturally from the state's favorable growing conditions alone. Idaho began stamping famous potatoes directly onto its state license plates in 1928, a small but persistent piece of rolling advertisement that put the state's agricultural identity in front of millions of drivers decades before more sophisticated marketing techniques existed. The Idaho Potato Commission, formally established in 1937, took this informal reputation and built it into something considerably more organized, developing strict quality grading standards and an aggressive promotional campaign specifically designed to make Idaho potato function as a trusted quality guarantee in the minds of American shoppers, not unlike how a specific wine region's name might guarantee a certain expected character to a knowledgeable buyer. The strategy worked remarkably well, and Idaho's potato industry today remains one of the most successful examples of sustained regional agricultural branding anywhere in American commercial history. The potato's transformation into some of the modern world's most recognizable prepared foods unfolded gradually across the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and it's worth spending a little time with these familiar, comfortable forms before we turn toward the crops, considerably more forward-looking modern chapter. The origins of the French fry remain genuinely, good-naturedly disputed between France and Belgium, with Belgian food historians pointing to documented evidence of fried potato strips being sold in the Meuse Valley region as early as the late 1600, prepared as a substitute during winter months when the small fish locals traditionally fried were unavailable due to frozen waterways. French claims to the dish's origin rest on somewhat less specific documentary evidence, but remain genuinely, persistently maintained within French culinary tradition, regardless. The dish's now common English name likely traces back to American soldiers encountering fried potatoes in French-speaking Belgium during the First World War, assuming, understandably enough given the local language, that they had discovered a genuinely French specialty. The potato chip's own popular origin story, crediting a chef named George Crumb working at a resort in Saratoga Springs, New York, in 1853, describes an annoyed diner repeatedly sending back overly thick fried potatoes, prompting Crumb to spitefully slice a batch impossibly thin and fry them until crisp, only to have the intended insult received instead as a genuine culinary delight. Food historians researching the story in more recent years have found the tale, while genuinely charming, likely oversimplifies a food preparation method that appears to have already existed in various forms before Crumb's specific, dramatically retold moment of supposed invention. Popular culinary legends often proving considerably tidier and considerably less strictly accurate than the messier reality historians eventually manage to piece together. By the 20th century, industrial food processing transformed the potato yet again, with the development of reliable commercial freezing technology in the 1920 and 30, eventually enabling mass production of frozen French fries, a development that would go on to reshape the American fast food industry entirely once companies, including McDonald's, began building their own core menu offerings substantially around the crops, now thoroughly reliable standardized preparation. Today, the potato ranks as the world's fourth most important food crop by total production, trailing only maize, wheat, and rice, cultivated across roughly 160 countries and feeding, in some meaningful dietary form, a genuinely enormous share of the entire global human population. China alone now produces more potatoes than any other single country on Earth, a striking geographic shift for a crop that spent its first 8,000 years confined entirely to one particular stretch of South American mountains. The frozen French fries rise to fast food dominance carries its own specific origin story worth including. Centered on an Idaho farmer and businessman named J.R. Simplot, who had built a substantial agricultural processing business through the middle of the 20th century. In 1967, Simplot secured a contract to supply frozen French fries to the rapidly expanding McDonald's restaurant chain, whose founder, Ray Kroc, had grown increasingly frustrated with the inconsistent quality and considerable labor required to prepare fresh-cut fries at every single location. Simplot's frozen fries offered McDonald's exactly what a rapidly scaling franchise business genuinely needed: a consistent, easily prepared product requiring minimal specialized labor at each individual restaurant. And the resulting partnership helped transform both companies, McDonald's, into the dominant global fast food chain it would soon become, and Simplot's own company into one of the largest privately held agricultural businesses in the United States, built substantially on the strength of one single, remarkably successful frozen potato product. Modern global production now exceeds 350 million metric tons annually, with China and India together accounting for a considerable share of the total, a striking geographic shift for a crop that spent its first 8,000 years confined entirely to a narrow stretch of South American mountains. Given everything we've just walked through together regarding Ireland's own catastrophic experience with genetic uniformity, it's worth asking a genuinely important question before we let this story drift any further toward its close. So how exactly do you protect a crop this globally important from ever repeating that same essential mistake again? The same narrow genetic bottleneck that turned one country's dependence into one of modern history's deadliest famines. The answer researchers have converged on involves deliberately carefully preserving exactly the kind of genetic diversity the LU Emperor variety's dominance had so thoroughly erased from Irish fields. The International Potato Center, formally established in 1971 in Lima, Peru, with support from the Rockefeller Foundation, and later becoming part of a broader international research network called CGIRE, maintains its living collection specifically as an insurance policy against future agricultural catastrophe, preserving genetic traits, including natural disease resistance genes that many modern commercial varieties have long since lost, that plant breeders can draw upon if a new blight, a new pest, or a changing climate someday threatens the world's considerably more genetically narrow modern potato supply. A direct institutional continuation of exactly the careful preservation work Andean farmers had already been quietly practicing for 8,000 years before the center's founders ever arrived to help. This same collection maintains a secondary, deliberately redundant backup as well, with duplicate seed and tissue samples stored at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, a secure facility built deep into a mountainside on a remote Norwegian archipelago well inside the Arctic Circle, designed specifically to preserve crop genetic diversity against essentially any conceivable catastrophe, war, natural disaster, or simple institutional failure elsewhere that might otherwise threaten a single, less redundantly protected collection. It's a genuinely striking image to hold in your mind as tonight's story continues drifting toward its own close. An entire mountain carved out specifically to protect the genetic memory of thousands of potato varieties, now sealed away in Arctic cold, specifically so that history's Irish lesson never needs to be learned again by anyone, anywhere, quite so catastrophically. That same instinct toward careful preservation found one of its most remarkable and most costly expressions decades before Svalbard existed at the Pavlovsk experiment station outside Leningrad, part of a pioneering seed bank collection established by Soviet botanist Nikolai Vyachvilov, who had spent decades before the Second World War traveling the world specifically to gather and preserve genetic samples of crop diversity, including one of the most significant potato collections assembled anywhere at the time. When Nazi forces besieged Leningrad beginning in 1941, trapping the city for nearly 900 days in conditions of genuinely catastrophic starvation. The scientists still working at the station found themselves guarding a vault containing thousands of edible seed and tuber samples. Precisely the kind of food a starving city desperately needed, while they themselves slowly starved alongside everyone else trapped within the siege. According to accounts documented by the Institute and later historians, several staff members died of starvation during the siege, reportedly surrounded by the very same edible potato and grain samples they had spent the entire ordeal deliberately, carefully refusing to eat, preserving the collection intact for a future they would not personally survive to see. It's worth letting that story settle fully before we move on, since it's a genuinely difficult, genuinely remarkable thing to hold alongside everything else tonight. The same instinct that led Andean farmers to carefully preserve dozens of distinct potato varieties against future risk. The same instinct that built the seed vault carved into an Arctic mountainside found its most extreme, most costly expression in a handful of Soviet scientists who chose, even as they starved, to protect a collection meant for people they would never meet. In a future they had no guarantee would even arrive. Ireland's catastrophe in the 1840 was not, unfortunately, history's only close encounter with potato-related famine. Germany experienced its own severe food crisis during the winter of 1916 to 1917, later remembered grimly as the turnip winter, when a combination of poor weather, wartime labor shortages, and a British naval blockade restricting food imports combined with a disappointing potato harvest to leave much of the German civilian population surviving through that winter largely on turnips, a considerably less palatable and less nutritious substitute crop, contributing to widespread malnutrition and an estimated several 100,000 civilian deaths before the war's eventual end. Diversity and reliable food itself, it turns out, has occasionally asked an almost unbearable price of the people entrusted with protecting it. And it's worth remembering gently that the seed banks we discussed earlier tonight exist at all partly because people somewhere along the way decided that price was still genuinely worth paying. That same deep, carefully preserved genetic diversity has recently found itself relevant to a considerably more forward-looking question than famine prevention alone, and it's worth spending our final stretch of tonight's journey with it. The potato's relationship with space travel actually began considerably earlier than the more publicized experiment we're about to spend time with, and it's worth filling in that fuller timeline. In October of 1995, a joint research project between NASA and the University of Wisconsin-Madison successfully grew a potato plant aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, making it the very first vegetable ever successfully cultivated in space. Grown within a specially sealed growth chamber designed to test how plants might eventually be cultivated to support long-duration space missions. The 1995 experiment focused primarily on understanding basic plant growth behavior in microgravity conditions, rather than testing survival in genuinely Mars-like soil. But it established over 2 decades before more publicized later research that this same 8,000-year-old crop was already being seriously, scientifically considered as a genuine candidate for feeding future astronauts. In 2016, researchers from the International Potato Center partnered with NASA Ames Research Center to conduct a genuinely serious scientific experiment, testing whether potatoes could successfully grow in soil conditions closely simulating the Martian surface, sealed within a specially constructed chamber designed to replicate Mars's atmospheric pressure, temperature swings, and radiation exposure as closely as available technology allowed. The experiment succeeded in producing viable potato growth under these deliberately harsh, Mars-simulating conditions, a genuinely significant finding given the potatoes' already well-documented tolerance for poor soil, minimal water, and the wide, difficult temperature swings its original Andean homeland had spent 8,000 years selecting it to survive in the first place. The researchers involved were, by all accounts, genuinely aware of the cultural resonance their experiment carried, arriving not long after the 2015 film adaptation of Andy Weir's novel. The Martian had already introduced a considerably wider public audience to the general idea of a stranded astronaut surviving by cultivating potatoes in Martian soil. The real scientific experiment wasn't simply chasing that same cultural moment, though, since the underlying practical logic runs genuinely deep. Any crop intended to support future long-duration space missions or eventual Martian settlement needs to tolerate extreme cold, minimal water, poor soil nutrients, and a short growing season. Precisely the same demanding combination of conditions that originally shaped the potato's entire evolutionary and agricultural history. High in the thin, cold air of the Andes, 8,000 years before anyone had any reason to imagine those same traits might someday matter for surviving on an entirely different planet. It's a genuinely remarkable thought to sit with as tonight's journey approaches its final resting place. The exact same traits, cold tolerance, drought resistance, the ability to produce genuine nutrition from thin, difficult soil that once let Andean farmers coax a reliable harvest from land where almost nothing else would grow, may very well end up being the same traits that someday let human beings grow their very first meal on another world entirely. The potato was never bred for space travel. It was simply bred patiently by ordinary farmers solving an ordinary, immediate problem for a difficulty considerably older and more terrestrial than anyone involved could possibly have anticipated. Sometimes the most forward-looking solution available to us was quietly finished and quietly waiting 8,000 years before we even knew we would eventually need it, before we let this story settle fully toward its close. It's worth returning briefly to a claim considerably larger than anything we've discussed so far. One that reframes almost everything we've covered tonight within an even wider historical significance. In 2011, economists Nathan Nunn and Nancy Chien published a detailed statistical study examining the potato's broader impact on Old World population growth and urbanization following its introduction from the Americas. Comparing regions of Europe and Asia with genuinely favorable growing conditions for the potato against otherwise similar regions where the crop grew poorly, Nunn and Chien found that the potato's introduction could statistically account for a meaningful share of the substantial population growth and urban expansion that Europe experienced between 1700 and 1900, a period that overlaps closely with the early industrial revolution's own emergence. Their underlying argument runs roughly as follows. A more reliable, more calorically efficient staple crop meant fewer families experiencing the recurring famines that had periodically checked European population growth for centuries, while simultaneously freeing up a meaningful share of agricultural labor that had previously been necessary just to produce enough cereal grain to feed everyone. Some of that freed labor, the argument continues, became available instead to move into the growing cities and factories that the Industrial Revolution was, during this same general period, beginning to demand in genuinely enormous numbers. It's a genuinely significant claim, suggesting the humble, once feared root vegetable we've spent all night with may have played a real, statistically measurable role in enabling the specific timing and scale of one of the most transformative economic shifts in modern human history. It's worth noting, in fairness, that this remains one interpretation among ongoing scholarly discussion about the Industrial Revolution's many genuinely tangled causes, rather than any single, universally settled explanation. But the statistical relationship these two economists documented has held up well to continued academic scrutiny in the years since. It's also worth spending a moment with the specific variety that eventually became the potato world's own closest equivalent to a single dominant, recognizable face, since its own origin carries a small, satisfying echo of the famine we spent considerable time with earlier tonight. American horticulturalist L.O. Burbank began breeding a new potato variety in the 1870, working specifically toward a hardier, more disease-resistant alternative to the vulnerable varieties descended from the very same narrow genetic stock that had failed so catastrophically in Ireland just a few decades earlier. Burbank's resulting variety, eventually refined further and introduced commercially as the Russet Burbank, proved remarkably successful, and its particular combination of size, starch content, and structural sturdiness would eventually make it the preferred variety for both baking and, considerably later, industrial French fry production, meaning a meaningful share of the fries produced by fast food chains around the world today trace back to one plant breeder's deliberate, careful response to the very same genetic vulnerability that had devastated Ireland. Different cultures today have settled into remarkably different relationships with just how much of the crop they actually consume. Belarus consistently ranks among the highest per capita potato consumers anywhere in the world, with average annual consumption estimated at well over 150 pounds per person, a genuinely staggering quantity when you actually try to picture it. Considerably more than most other nations manage even among Europe's traditionally potato-heavy culinary cultures. It's a fitting, quietly amusing detail to end this particular thread on, that a plant so thoroughly feared and resisted across so much of Europe for so many generations eventually found, in at least one corner of the continent, a population willing to eat considerably more of it than almost anyone else on the entire planet. One further small cultural thread deserves a place here. Vodka, closely associated today with Russian and Eastern European drinking tradition, has historically been distilled from a range of different base ingredients depending on regional availability and cost, including grain, but also, quite commonly across parts of Poland, Russia, and other Eastern European potato-growing regions. The potato itself, once the crop had become sufficiently abundant and inexpensive following its eventual widespread adoption across the region. Potato-based vodka production expanded considerably during periods when grain supplies were needed more urgently for direct human consumption, particularly during and after various wartime shortages, with distillers turning toward the cheaper, more abundant potato as a practical, readily available substitute base ingredient. It's a small, quietly fitting cultural footnote that a plant so thoroughly, painfully associated with hunger and famine across so much of tonight's story eventually also became the base ingredient for one of Eastern Europe's most widely recognized alcoholic exports. The same reliable abundance that once helped prevent starvation, eventually proving abundant enough to spare for considerably less essential purposes as well. The genetic lesson Ireland taught the world so painfully continues shaping active agricultural research today, and it's worth spending a little time with this genuinely current thread before we finally return home to where tonight's whole journey actually began. Plant scientists working in recent years have increasingly turned back to exactly the kind of wild and traditional Andean potato varieties preserved at the International Potato Center, searching within their genetic diversity for natural disease resistance, traits that centuries of narrowing toward a small handful of commercially popular varieties had gradually left behind. Researchers have successfully identified genes conferring genuine resistance to Phytophthora ineffestans, the very same blight responsible for Ireland's catastrophe within certain wild Andean potato relatives, and modern plant breeding techniques, including both traditional careful crossbreeding and newer, more precise gene editing methods, have begun reintroducing these same protective traits back into modern commercial potato varieties. In a genuinely fitting piece of historical symmetry, the same deep reservoir of Andean genetic diversity that Irish farmers had lost access to in the 1840 is now, nearly 2 centuries later, being drawn upon specifically to help prevent history's exact same vulnerability from ever repeating itself again at that same catastrophic scale. Science reached one further significant milestone in the potato's long story in 2011, when an international consortium of researchers spanning universities and institutions across more than a dozen countries completed the first full genetic sequencing of the potato genome, published in the journal Nature. The project revealed a genuinely complex genetic structure, with the potato carrying somewhere in the range of 39,000 genes, notably more than the human genome itself contains, reflecting the plant's own complicated evolutionary history of natural hybridization and genetic duplication across its many thousands of years of wild and cultivated development. Having the complete genome mapped and freely available to researchers worldwide has since accelerated exactly the kind of targeted disease resistance breeding work we just discussed, allowing plant scientists to identify and track specific protective genes considerably more precisely than the patient, purely observational crossbreeding techniques available to earlier generations of researchers ever could. Modern plant breeding research has continued expanding well beyond disease resistance alone, with current programs working to develop potato varieties bred specifically for enhanced nutritional content, including elevated levels of iron, zinc, and vitamin A, traits deliberately selected to help address chronic micronutrient deficiencies affecting vulnerable populations across parts of the developing world. It's the same essential story, told once more in a considerably more modern register: patient, careful, incremental breeding work aimed at helping this same 8,000-year-old plant keep meeting whatever difficult new conditions happen to arrive next. This work connects directly to a living, present-day continuation of the very same Andean farming tradition we spent our first stretch of tonight's journey exploring. Since the thousands of traditional potato varieties preserved in seed banks didn't simply survive in cold storage alone. Not far from Cusco, in Peru, a coalition of Quechua-speaking farming communities established what's now called the Potato Park in the early 2000s, a roughly 9,000-acre area of protected mountain land where local farmers continue actively cultivating well over 1,000 distinct traditional potato varieties, using methods directly descended from Inca and pre-Inca agricultural practice, working in ongoing partnership with the International Potato Center to help maintain genetic diversity that exists nowhere else, quite literally, in living cultivated form. Peru itself has, in recent decades, worked deliberately to reclaim and celebrate the crop's own deep national origin, formally establishing June 30th as National Potato Day in 2005, a date chosen specifically to honor both the plant's ancient Andean heritage and the ongoing work of the farmers still preserving its genuine diversity today. Peruvian chefs have led a broader culinary movement over the same recent decades, deliberately showcasing native potato varieties and traditional preparations, including KOWSA, a layered cold dish built from mashed yellow potato, and PAHPA a la Huancaína, sliced boiled potatoes served beneath a rich, spiced cheese sauce, in an effort to bring the country's own extraordinary potato heritage back into serious international culinary recognition after centuries during which the crop's origins had been considerably better known and celebrated almost everywhere else in the world, except the very mountains where the entire story actually began. That same heirloom variety enthusiasm has, in recent decades, spread into farmers' markets and specialty grocers across North America and Europe as well, with chefs and small-scale growers increasingly seeking out and cultivating traditional colorful varieties, purple Peruvian, French fingerling, and various heirloom red and blue-skinned types among them, specifically as an alternative to the small handful of standardized commercial varieties that dominate most large-scale grocery store supply chains. This growing specialty market remains, admittedly, a genuinely small fraction of overall global potato production and consumption, but it reflects a meaningful, gradually building cultural shift back toward appreciating exactly the kind of deep, genuine diversity that defined the potato's original 8,000-year Andean story. It stands as a genuinely meaningful bridge across the entire story we've walked through together tonight. The same essential relationship between people and this particular plant still being actively, carefully tended by the direct cultural descendants of the very farmers who first coaxed a toxic wild tuber into something worth building an empire around. Modern cataloging efforts suggest the true scope of potato genetic diversity worldwide may be even more extensive than the International Potato Center's own already substantial collection reflects. Researchers estimate that somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 distinct traditional potato varieties are still cultivated across the Andes today, alongside several thousand additional wild potato species and subspecies documented growing across a range stretching from the southwestern United States down through Chile, each carrying its own unique combination of genetic traits shaped by whatever particular environment it happens to have adapted to across countless generations. It's a genuinely humbling number to sit with, that the handful of varieties most of the world actually encounters, a russet here, a red-skinned round one there, represents only the barest, thinnest sliver of a genetic diversity that remains, even now, only partially cataloged and understood. It's worth asking gently one further question here. The Andes gave the world more than one remarkable domesticated crop, quinoa among them, a genuinely nutritious grain-like seed cultivated in this same region for thousands of years alongside the potato. Yet quinoa never achieved anything close to the same rapid, thorough global adoption the potato eventually managed, remaining, for most of the intervening centuries, a comparatively minor regional crop, until a relatively recent surge of international interest, beginning only in the past few decades. The difference likely comes down to exactly the same practical calculus that eventually won over Frederick's Prussia and Parmentier-Wise France. The potato's genuinely exceptional caloric yield per acre, its short growing season, and its remarkable tolerance for poor soil and difficult climate, advantages considerably harder to match than quinoa's own genuine, but comparatively more modest, nutritional benefits ever quite managed to offer a hungry 18th century European farmer weighing which unfamiliar New World crop was actually worth the risk of planting. Sometimes the crop that changes the world isn't necessarily the healthiest one available, or even the most versatile one. It's simply the one that most reliably keeps a family fed through the specific difficult winter they happen to actually be facing. The potato's long association with poverty, hard labor, and quiet daily survival found its way into fine art as well. Most famously in Vincent van Gogh's 1885 painting, The Potato Eaters, depicting a peasant family gathered around a dim, lamplit table in the Dutch countryside, sharing a simple meal of potatoes and coffee after a long day's field labor. Van Gogh, in his own surviving letters, wrote that he had deliberately chosen coarse, unrefined colors and rough, heavy brushwork specifically to honor the genuine dignity of the laborers he was depicting, describing his wish to show, in his own words, that these people, digging the earth with the very same worn hands now raising the potatoes to their mouths, had honestly earned their humble meal. The painting remains, well over a century later, one of the most recognized and studied works of Van Gogh's entire career, a lasting artistic monument to exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous rural labor that had, by the 1880, come to be almost inseparably associated with this one particular crop across large stretches of Europe. Even European military history couldn't entirely resist the potato's quiet pull into its own vocabulary. The War of the Bavarian Succession, fought between Prussia and Austria in 1778 and 1779, involved so little actual combat and so much difficulty simply keeping opposing armies adequately supplied with food in hostile territory, that soldiers on both sides reportedly spent a considerable share of the entire campaign foraging for potatoes in nearby fields rather than engaging each other in any serious battle. The conflict earned itself the lasting, gently mocking nickname, the Potato War, among later historians. A genuinely fitting footnote for a plant that had, by this point in its European story, become thoroughly tangled into daily survival across an entire continent, showing up even in the improvised, hungry margins of an otherwise largely uneventful 18th century war. Even American toy history found its own small, genuinely charming way of engaging with this same humble vegetable. Inventor George Lerner developed Mr. Potato Head in 1949, originally designed as a set of small plastic facial features: eyes, ears, a nose, a mustache, meant to be pressed directly into an actual potato parents would supply themselves from their own kitchen. Before the toy was eventually redesigned with its own plastic potato-shaped body, once growing safety concerns about children handling pins and sharp plastic pieces around real, perishable food led manufacturers to reconsider the original design. Mr. Potato Head became, remarkably, the first toy ever advertised directly to children on American television, debuting in a 1952 commercial that helped establish an entirely new advertising strategy, still shaping children's marketing today. One more small, unexpected way. This same ancient Andean plant ended up quietly present at the very beginning of a considerably more modern chapter of American commercial history. That same efficiency has drawn renewed agricultural research attention in recent years, this time connected to a considerably more current concern than famine or interplanetary travel alone. As shifting rainfall patterns and rising average temperatures place growing strain on traditional wheat and rice cultivation across parts of the world, agricultural researchers have increasingly highlighted the potato's comparatively short growing season and genuine tolerance for marginal, difficult land as a potentially valuable resource for regions facing an increasingly unpredictable climate. It's a genuinely fitting continuation of the exact same story we spent our very first stretch of tonight's journey with. A plant originally shaped by 8,000 years of adaptation to one of the most difficult, unforgiving growing environments anywhere on the planet, now being seriously reconsidered as a genuine hedge against an entirely different, considerably more recent kind of environmental difficulty. It's worth closing out the potato's modern global story with a reminder that its continued spread hasn't stopped at Europe, North America, and China alone. Agricultural development programs across parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have, in recent decades, actively promoted potato cultivation as a genuine tool for improving food security in regions facing considerable agricultural pressure from population growth and increasingly unpredictable rainfall. Rwanda, working alongside international agricultural researchers, has developed disease-resistant potato varieties specifically suited to its own highland growing regions, helping the crop become an increasingly significant contributor to national food security over the past 2 decades. Bangladesh has similarly expanded potato cultivation substantially in recent years, now ranking among the world's larger producers by total volume grown specifically because the crop's efficient use of limited land helps a densely populated country get considerably more usable nutrition out of every available acre than many traditional cereal alternatives could manage. It's the same essential calculation that first drew Frederick the Great's Prussia toward the crop nearly 3 centuries ago, playing out again today in entirely different corners of the world for essentially the same enduring, practical reason. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has, for years, promoted the potato as a genuinely significant tool in the ongoing global effort against hunger and food insecurity, going so far as to formally designate 2008 as the International Year of the Potato, explicitly recognizing the crop's capacity to provide reliable nutrition on marginal land, in difficult climates and within the tight economic constraints facing many of the world's poorest farming communities. Today, researchers estimate that well over 1 billion people worldwide consume potatoes as a regular, meaningful part of their diet. A global reach that would have been genuinely unimaginable to the wary French clergy, the suspicious Russian peasants, and the Scottish ministers who once refused to let this same plant anywhere near their own tables. It's worth returning near the very end of tonight's journey to a genuinely important scientific question we left only loosely answered at the beginning. Exactly where, specifically, within the vast stretch of the Andes, the modern cultivated potato actually first originated. For years, researchers debated whether domestication had occurred at a single location or across multiple, separate sites scattered throughout the mountains. In 2005, botanist David Spooner led a research team that conducted detailed genetic analysis, comparing DNA samples from thousands of wild and cultivated potato specimens. And their results proved genuinely decisive. Every single cultivated potato variety examined, from the thousands still grown across the Andes today to the handful of narrow commercial varieties dominating fields worldwide, traced back through clear genetic lineage to a single origin point: wild potato populations native to the region immediately surrounding Lake Titicaca, on the border between modern Peru and Bolivia. Precisely the same high, cold, thin-aired landscape we began tonight's entire journey standing within. It's worth being honest about one further layer of scientific complexity here, since good science rarely stays quite as simple as its first confident headline suggests. And our own commitment tonight has been to the real, careful picture rather than the tidiest one available. While the Spooner team's 2005 research firmly established the Lake Ttkahka region as the origin point for potato domestication, generally later genetic research has identified a more complicated story, specifically regarding the varieties that eventually spread most widely around the modern world. Potatoes native to the Andean highlands are adapted to the relatively equal day and night lengths found near the equator and don't reliably form tubers under the longer summer daylight hours typical of higher latitude regions like most of Europe and North America. Subsequent genetic studies have found that modern commercial potato varieties, the ones actually growing in Idaho fields or German farms today, carry significant genetic contribution from a separate, secondary population of potatoes native to the Chiloé archipelago along the coast of southern Chile, a lower latitude adapted lineage whose genetics proved essential to the crop's later successful spread into higher latitude growing regions worldwide. The truest version of tonight's origin story, in other words, isn't quite as simple as one single lake alone. It's one primary Andean highland origin, responsible for the crop's original domestication and its still thriving deep diversity, joined later by a second, separate Chilean contribution that happened to carry exactly the genetic adaptation the rest of the world's higher latitude farmland would eventually need in order to grow it successfully at all. There is something genuinely fitting, almost satisfying in its quiet symmetry, about ending our own long journey exactly where careful modern genetic science has confirmed the real one actually began. It's a small, gentle pleasure, worth noting, too, how many different names this one plant eventually collected as it settled into kitchens and languages across the entire world. German speakers call it Kartoffel, itself borrowed and adapted centuries ago from the Italian tartufo. Truffle, the very same comparison Pedro Ciesa de Leown reached for in his own earliest written description. French speakers call it pomme de terre, literally apple of the earth, a genuinely poetic name for something that spends its entire life buried in soil, never once seeing daylight until the moment it's finally dug up. Quechua speakers in the Andes, whose ancestors gave the world this plant in the first place, still use their own original word, pawpaw, a name that predates every other version by thousands of years, and that has, in a small, quiet irony, been folded directly into Spanish, and from there into the English word we ourselves have used to describe this same plant all night. Every single one of these names, dug up in a different language, is still, underneath all its own local flavor, reaching for the exact same humble, buried thing. The common English nickname for the potato, spud, carries its own small etymological mystery, with the most widely accepted explanation tracing the word back to a narrow, spade-like digging tool, once used specifically for harvesting root vegetables from the ground. The tool's own name, gradually transferring over time to describe the vegetable it was most commonly used to dig up. Other proposed origins exist and remain genuinely debated among etymologists, including one persistent but almost certainly false popular legend claiming the word originated as an acronym for a 19th century anti-potato society. A charming story that etymologists studying the actual documentary record have found no genuine evidence to support beyond direct food consumption. Potato starch has also found its way into a genuinely wide range of industrial applications worth briefly acknowledging, including use as a binding agent in paper manufacturing, a thickening agent in textile production, and more recently, as a base material in the development of biodegradable plastic alternatives, as manufacturers search for renewable substitutes to petroleum-based plastics. Potato starch's particular molecular structure gives it useful adhesive and thickening properties that industrial chemists have found genuinely valuable across these varied applications, meaning the same plant we've spent all night following through empire, famine, and Martian soil experiments has also, quietly and considerably less dramatically, found its way into the paper this story might once have been printed on, or the packaging that carried some entirely unrelated product to someone's door. It's worth acknowledging honestly, too, that the potato's modern nutritional reputation carries its own genuine, ongoing scientific debate. Nutrition researchers generally agree that a whole, simply prepared potato offers genuine nutritional value, meaningful fiber, potassium, vitamin C, and reasonably complete protein for a plant food largely concentrated just beneath the skin. Considerably more debate surrounds the potatoes' more heavily processed forms, since French fries and potato chips, prepared with substantial added oil and salt, carry a nutritional profile quite different from a boiled or baked potato eaten plainly. And some nutrition researchers have specifically studied and raised genuine concern about the potato's relatively high glycemic index, particularly relevant for populations managing diabetes risk. Other researchers push back against treating the potato as uniquely problematic, noting that preparation method and portion size shape its actual health impact considerably more than the vegetable's own basic nutritional identity does. It remains, honestly, a genuinely active area of ongoing nutrition science rather than a fully settled question either way. One more small example of a pattern threaded through tonight's entire story. A plant whose true, complete picture keeps resisting any single tidy, final verdict. Right up through the present day, there's a quiet imbalance worth naming honestly here, before we let this whole long story finally rest. History remembers Parmentier-wise dinner parties and Frederick's decrees, remembers Van Gogh's careful brushwork and L.O. Other B.U.R. Banks' disease-resistant breeding program, remembers, by name, nearly every European figure who spent a few years or a few decades bringing the potato more fully into wider acceptance. History does not remember the names of a single one of the actual Andean farmers who spent 8,000 years doing the genuinely difficult foundational work, breeding down the toxin levels, developing chunayo, cultivating thousands of distinct varieties, precisely calibrated to one particular mountainside's particular soil and altitude, building the entire deep genetic foundation that every later chapter of tonight's story, the empire, the famine, the seed banks, the Mars experiment, actually rests upon. Those names simply were never recorded anywhere any surviving document has managed to preserve. It's worth sitting with that imbalance, gently rather than trying to resolve it, since there isn't really a tidy way to resolve it at this distance. The best available correction isn't a name, since none survive to give. It's simply honest acknowledgement, the same kind the Potato Park's living farmers and the International Potato Center's careful preservation work are already quietly providing today, treating this deep, ancient Andean knowledge not as a historical curiosity, but as an active, ongoing, still continuing contribution carried forward by living descendants doing recognizably similar work in recognizably similar mountains, right now, tonight, while the rest of the world sleeps. There's a fitting, gentle irony worth resting on as tonight's journey turns fully toward its close. That a plant with a history, this genuinely difficult, tangled up in famine, and forced decree and centuries of outright suspicion, eventually settled into a role across so many different cultures as pure, uncomplicated comfort. Mashed potatoes, soft and warm and utterly undemanding, appear on tables across an enormous range of otherwise unrelated culinary traditions, specifically as the dish reached for during difficult moments. Offered to the sick, the grieving, the exhausted, the very young, and the very old, precisely because it asks so little of the body digesting it, and gives back so much simple, warm satisfaction in return. It's a genuinely fitting final character for tonight's own unhurried story to settle into, since comfort, quiet and undemanding, and entirely without drama, is exactly the note we're gently reaching for right now too, as this whole long journey finally, patiently, comes into rest before we finally let this whole long story rest. It's worth taking one last slow moment to actually sit with just how much time 8,000 years genuinely represents, since the number has come up so many times tonight that it risks sliding past without ever quite landing. 8,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt did not yet exist, and would not for another several thousand years still to come. Writing itself in any form anywhere on earth had not yet been invented. The last woolly mammoths were still alive, holding on in isolated pockets of the far north. Human civilization, in the sense of cities, kings, and written law, was still a genuinely distant future event, waiting patiently on the other side of thousands of additional years. Most of humanity's own ancestors would need to live through first. And somewhere in the Andes, already, quietly, patiently, someone was kneeling in cold mountain soil, working out how to make a mildly poisonous wild tuber safe enough to eat. The potato's own story didn't just precede recorded history. In a very real sense, it was already underway before recorded history, as we understand the term today, had even properly begun. Let's go back now, one last time, to where tonight's whole journey actually began. High in the Andes, above the cloud line, where the air runs thin and the nights turn bitterly cold even under a warm daytime sun. Picture the shore of that one particular lake again, Titicaca, its water dark and still and impossibly high above sea level, ringed by mountains that would go on to shape everything we've spent tonight following outward from this single point. Somewhere along that shoreline, roughly 8,000 years ago, a person crouched down in the thin mountain grass, dug a small, unpromising, faintly toxic tuber out of the cold earth, and decided, for reasons entirely lost to us now, that this particular plant, out of everything else growing on that same difficult mountainside, was worth the trouble of trying again next season. We will never know that person's name. We will never know whether they succeeded on their first attempt or their 100th, or whether it was actually many hundreds of different people across many different valleys, each independently arriving at the same patient conclusion across many overlapping generations. What we do know, thanks to careful modern genetic science, is that their work succeeded thoroughly enough and was carried forward faithfully enough by everyone who came after them, that every single potato eaten anywhere on earth tonight, mashed or fried or roasted or freeze-dried in a mountain wind, or growing right now inside a sealed chamber somewhere, quietly proving it could survive the surface of another planet entirely, still carries that same original, patient decision inside it. That's really the whole of tonight's story, when you let everything else fall gently away. Not empires, though there was an empire. Not famine, though there was famine, and it deserves to be remembered honestly rather than smoothed over. Not Mars, though Mars is genuinely, seriously part of where this story is currently still heading. Just one very old, very patient relationship between people and a plant that asked for almost nothing, and over 8,000 careful years gave back almost everything. If your mind is still drifting somewhere back there among the mountains and the frost and the quiet market stalls of purple and gold, that's all right. There's nothing left to hold onto tonight, nothing you need to remember for later. Let your jaw loosen one more time. Let your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you up, mattress or couch or chair, wherever tonight happens to have found you. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last. The way a field finally settles once the last of the harvest has been carried in, and the frost is left alone again to do its own quiet, patient work. There's nothing left to carry forward from tonight. No fact you need to hold on to. No date you need to remember. Just the general, gentle shape of it, if any of it stayed with you at all. That the most ordinary things sitting quietly in your own kitchen tonight very often carry the longest, strangest, most patient histories of anything around you. And that somewhere, right now, on a mountainside half a world away, someone is still carefully tending the very same plant in the very same patient spirit that a stranger whose name no one remembers first coaxed out of the cold Andean earth 8,000 years ago. Sleep well.